Virginia Bullock meticulously reviewed the guest list for her daughter's wedding, making occasional corrections with her elegant handwriting. Beyond the office window, the summer afternoon faded, filling the room with a soft, golden light. She smiled one last time. 327 guests. A bit too many, perhaps, but there was no other way. The family's status demanded it. Their veterinary clinic chain, Pet Care Elite, was renowned across the East Coast, and Theodore was considered one of the leading neurosurgeons in the state. Esther, their only daughter, had insisted on a more modest ceremony, but Virginia had stood her ground. "Sweetheart, you're only going to get married once," she had said, brushing aside the unpleasant chill that ran down her spine. Her own marriage was no longer as serene as it appeared from the outside. Her phone vibrated, a message from the wedding planner. "Issues with the florist again." Virginia replied briefly and directly, the way she had grown accustomed to handling all matters. Years of running a business had taught her efficiency. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed movement at the entrance. Theodore had returned from work. Lately, it was rare to see him come home alone. Her thoughts wandered back to the previous week, to the fundraising gala for the Children's Hospital. Priscilla Hathorne, the new nurse in Theodore's ward, had shown up, seemingly by chance. Impeccable makeup, a designer dress far too expensive for her salary. Virginia had watched her flit among the guests all evening, occasionally lingering too close to Theodore for mere professionalism. "Honey, I'm home." Her husband's voice broke her reverie. Virginia rose from the desk, smoothing the folds of her pearl-gray dress, and stepped into the hallway. Theodore looked tired but satisfied, undoubtedly another successful surgery. She knew his routine by heart. He would go upstairs, shower, and return to his office to work on paperwork. They used to have dinner together often, discussing their day. Now, those moments were becoming increasingly rare. "How was your day?" she asked, kissing his cheek out of habit. He smelled of hospital sterility, and faintly of a feminine perfume. Virginia pretended not to notice. "A challenging operation, but the patient is stable. Priscilla did an excellent job assisting," he said, his tone carrying a warmth that had once been reserved for her. "By the way, she sends her best wishes to Esther. How kind of her to take an interest in the wedding preparations," Virginia replied, masking her emotions with practiced composure. After 26 years of marriage, she had learned to keep her feelings in check. "Why don't you head upstairs? I'll have Marta serve dinner in an hour." Theodore nodded distractedly, already lost in his own thoughts as he ascended the staircase. Virginia watched him go, reflecting on how much their marriage had changed in the past year. She had initially dismissed Priscilla's presence in their lives as a passing fancy. Men his age often sought outside validation. But the situation was becoming increasingly unpleasant. Returning to her study, Virginia opened her planner. Just 15 days until the wedding. Tomorrow, there was a meeting with the florist, followed by Esther's dress fitting, and in the evening, a charity dinner at the country club. She knew Priscilla would be there. She hadn't missed a single social event lately. As Virginia became increasingly self-assured, it was as though she was testing the boundaries of what was permissible. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was photos from the latest event at the Virginia Country Club. She scrolled through them slowly, pausing at a particular image, Priscilla, in another designer dress, leaning in to whisper something to Theodore. His hand rested on her waist a touch longer than appropriate. Surrounding them were the wives of the other doctors, all of whom had known Virginia for years. Their sympathetic gazes spoke volumes. Virginia closed the photo gallery and retrieved a small folder from the safe. Inside were the results of a private investigation into Priscilla Hawthorne's past. Up until now, Virginia had confined herself to gathering information without taking action. But with each passing day, it became increasingly clear that patience wasn't always a virtue, especially when it came to people who mistook it for weakness. As she sifted through old photographs spread across her study table, memories came rushing back. Esther had asked her for some snapshots for the wedding video, and now Virginia found herself delving into her own past. There was a picture from her first meeting with Theodore, a medical conference in Boston where she had been presenting her very first veterinary clinic. Back then, it had been a tiny space in a less than prestigious neighborhood. But even then, she knew exactly what she wanted to achieve. Theodore had approached her booth, intrigued by her innovative diagnostic techniques. They had talked for nearly an hour, comparing human and veterinary medicine practices. He was passionate about his field, brimming with ideas, and described complex surgeries with such enthusiasm that it was impossible not to be captivated. A young neurosurgeon just starting his career, he already had ambitious plans for the future. Their romance had progressed quickly. Theodore courted her with charm, showered her with attention, and gave her unique gifts. Virginia vividly recalled a small robot he had assembled with his own hands. It was meant to symbolize the precision of his surgical skills. That earnest sweetness had won her over, as had his genuine admiration for her business acumen. They were married 6 months later in a modest ceremony attended by close friends. Virginia didn't have extra funds for an extravagant celebration. All her resources were tied up in developing her clinic. At the time, Theodore had said he was proud to have such a practical wife. It was that practicality that saw them through those challenging early years when his career was just taking off, and her business required constant reinvestment. The pregnancy had come as a surprise 2 years after their wedding. Virginia could still remember how terrified she felt. The clinic had just begun turning a profit, and she had finally secured a steady client base. Theodore had been supportive, taking on some of Virginia's burdens. He would come to the clinic after his hospital shifts, help with paperwork, or fill in for an ill administrator. Back then, they truly were a team. Esther was born in June, and Virginia returned to work just 3 months later. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. They had a wonderful nanny, but Virginia spent every free moment with her daughter. Theodore, too, tried to be a good father despite his heavy workload at the hospital. Of course, most of the responsibilities fell on Virginia's shoulders, but it seemed natural at the time. She was better at organizing their lives. The first major crisis hit when Esther turned 7. Theodore received an offer from a prestigious clinic in California. Virginia flatly refused to relocate. Her business was thriving, and she had just opened a second clinic. They had their first serious fight. Theodore accused her of not supporting his career, and she reminded him of his promises to work as a team. In the end, he stayed, but something broke in their relationship. The following years passed relatively peacefully. Virginia expanded her business, opening new clinics, introducing modern treatment techniques, and building a professional network. Theodore, meanwhile, gained recognition in professional circles, performing increasingly complex and successful surgeries. Both worked hard and primarily saw each other at night and on weekends. Esther grew into an intelligent and independent girl, delighting both parents with her achievements. Virginia could pinpoint the moment she first noticed the change in her husband. It was about 5 years ago at the annual fundraising gala for the medical community. Theodore was delivering a speech about his department's accomplishments, and there was a new tone in his voice, one of superiority, almost arrogance. He spoke more about himself than the team. Later, in a conversation with colleagues, he spoke dismissively of a doctor who had made a treatment error. Money began to change him subtly. Expensive suits, collector's watches, membership in an elite golf club, Virginia didn't mind, they could afford it. But there was an ostentatious luxury to his behavior, a desire to flaunt his success. She noticed he was becoming condescending to those beneath him, and sometimes, even to her. After all, veterinary medicine wasn't as prestigious as neurosurgery, as he saw it. The final straw came when he refused to help an old friend in need. The friend required surgery but couldn't afford it. Theodore could have negotiated a discount or advocated for him with the hospital authorities. Instead, he advised the friend to go to a more affordable clinic. "I can't risk my reputation for charity," he said. That was when Virginia set the photos aside. In 26 years, she had built a successful business, raised a wonderful daughter, and kept her marriage intact. But as she looked at the pictures, she realized that the man she had fallen in love with had disappeared. In his place was someone else, outwardly successful, but inwardly weak, dependent on the opinions of others and the approval of others. Perhaps that's why Priscilla's sudden appearance didn't surprise her much. Women like her have an unmistakable way of perceiving the vulnerabilities of successful men. Priscilla first showed up at the hospital in early spring. Virginia saw her for the first time during a board of directors meeting, where Priscilla stood out as one of the primary benefactors. The new nurse in the neurosurgery ward kept a modest demeanor, yet something about her set off Virginia's instincts. Maybe it was the overly attentive gaze with which she studied everyone in the room, or the barely perceptible condescending smile she gave when another nurse tried to strike up a conversation. Theodore introduced Priscilla as a promising specialist who had recently transferred from a private clinic. "She has amazing intuition in the operating room," he said enthusiastically. At home, Virginia realized it had been a long time since her husband had spoken so passionately about his work. Usually, she had to pry the details of his day out of him. Theodore's behavior began to change gradually. At first, he started staying at the hospital longer than usual. Then came urgent weekend consultations. Priscilla, without fail, assisted him in every complex surgery, even though there were other nurses on the floor with more experience. Virginia noticed changes in her husband's wardrobe, too. Theodore had always dressed well, but now his appearance had a distinct air of refinement. One day, she caught him meticulously examining himself in the mirror, adjusting his tie just so. "Priscilla says this looks more professional," he offered, responding to a question she hadn't even asked. Changes were happening at the hospital as well. Theodore began discussing matters with Priscilla that he used to handle on his own. She had a way of presenting her opinions as though they were his ideas all along. Virginia observed this subtle manipulation during one board of directors meeting. The team was deciding on the purchase of new equipment when Priscilla casually suggested, "Shouldn't we consider a proposal from medical systems? They say their equipment is more advanced." Theodore, who had been adamant about using another supplier, suddenly paused, deep in thought. By the end of the meeting, he was passionately championing the merits of the company Priscilla had suggested. At home, Theodore began checking his phone more frequently and retreating to another room for calls. Virginia overheard snippets of his conversations. "Of course, you're right. Yes, I understand. We'll have to think about it." After these calls, Theodore would seem distracted, lost in thought. At the charity event for the pediatric ward, Priscilla showed up wearing a dress that was clearly beyond her financial means. She exuded confidence, easily striking up conversations with the chief doctor's wives, discussing the latest theater releases as though she belonged. Virginia noticed how the nurse discreetly guided Theodore, a light touch on his elbow, a whisper in his ear, and he was off, mingling with the right people. One particularly hurtful incident was Esther's birthday. They had planned a family dinner at their daughter's favorite restaurant, but at the last minute, Theodore announced he had an urgent operation. "Priscilla believes the patient can't wait," he said apologetically. Later, Virginia discovered the operation hadn't been urgent at all. He could have easily waited until the next day. Even Theodore's colleagues noticed the change. Dror Harris, an old friend, once said, "Theodore was different before. We used to have heated debates about treatments. Now, he just goes along with whatever that nurse suggests." There was a hint of irritation in his voice. One morning, while sorting through the mail, Virginia noticed a jewelry bill. Theodore had never hidden financial documents before. All their accounts were shared. It was clear the diamond bracelet wasn't for her. She preferred more understated jewelry. A week later, she saw it on Priscilla's wrist. But that wasn't the worst part. At a traditional family dinner with their closest friends, Theodore suddenly started discussing modern views on marriage. "Priscilla says monogamy is a relic of the past," he said, carefully avoiding his wife's gaze. An awkward silence followed. Virginia pretended not to hear, but something inside her recoiled. That night, lying awake, she realized for the first time that the problem wasn't Priscilla herself. It was how easily Theodore had allowed himself to be swayed by another woman. His malleability, his willingness to abandon his principles for the approval of the young nurse, was more than disappointing, it was disheartening. Where was the confident doctor she had married 2 decades ago? Where was the man unafraid to speak his mind? Virginia had always approached problems rationally. She knew it was time to gather information about Priscilla Hawthorne. Something about her sudden appearance felt too calculated. She was manipulating the situation with an unsettling level of skill. The news of the affair had come in the most mundane way. There were no dramatic coincidences or fateful accidents. A receptionist at one of the city's finest hotels, whose dog was a regular patient at Virginia's clinic, had called to ask about vaccines. Just as the call was wrapping up, she hesitated and said, "Mrs. Bullock, I don't mean to be indiscreet, but Dr. Bullock asked me not to mention his visits. I thought you should know." Virginia thanked her and hung up without a word. She didn't stage a stakeout or gather more evidence. That single call was enough. Years of running a business had taught her to trust her instincts, and her professional intuition told her the receptionist wouldn't risk the hotel's reputation over idle gossip. That evening, she observed Theodore as he passionately described a complex surgical procedure. His eyes sparkled, his hands moved animatedly as he mimicked precise medical maneuvers. Priscilla chimed in with an unconventional suggestion, dropping her assistant's name for what felt like the 100th time. Virginia listened carefully, noticing how often Theodore echoed Priscilla's intonations, the way he drew out certain words just like she did. Her first instinct was to file for divorce immediately. Her financial advisor had prepared the documents long ago. She wouldn't be a successful businesswoman if she didn't plan for every possible outcome. But something held her back. It wasn't fear of being alone or clinging to old habits. It was Esther. Their daughter was preparing to defend her architecture thesis, a project she had poured her heart into. Her work, a design for a modern medical center, was ambitious and intricate. Theodore had been helping her with the layout of the operating rooms, and their shared discussions had brought them closer for the first time in years. Virginia had seen the way Esther's face lit up when her father delved into technical details, how she hung on to his every word. That afternoon, after the receptionist's call, Virginia stayed in her office late into the night, methodically analyzing the situation. She was used to breaking problems into their components, assessing risks, and calculating outcomes. A divorce would undoubtedly devastate Esther at the worst possible moment. Her daughter was too busy, too vulnerable to handle such a blow. And besides, there was something off about Priscilla's behavior. Virginia's experienced eye noticed a pattern in her actions. The so-called random encounters felt too orchestrated, her words too calculated. There was a system behind it all, and Virginia was determined to uncover the truth. Virginia had always been adept at reading people. 20 years in the business world had taught her how to spot manipulators. Her instincts told her something was off. She began keeping a closer eye on Theodore, who was coming home more and more frequently with extravagant gifts for Priscilla. Expensive perfumes, jewelry, designer accessories, and lavish checks. His spending was spiraling out of control. When Virginia questioned his financial recklessness, Theodore's irritation was uncharacteristically sharp. "I make enough not to count every penny," he snapped. Meanwhile, Priscilla's influence at the hospital was growing. She attended key meetings, even when her role didn't require it, and made valuable suggestions about department organization. She cultivated a friendship with the chief physician's wife. Virginia noticed how some of Theodore's colleagues began avoiding him, steering clear of shared shifts and consultations. One evening at a family dinner, Esther, their daughter, casually mentioned seeing her father with Priscilla at a cafe. "They seem to be discussing something medical," she said, entirely unsuspecting. Virginia's sharp eyes caught Theodore's hand trembling ever so slightly, though his face betrayed nothing. He's learned to lie, she thought, the realization hitting her like a dull ache. Life offered little time for introspection. Esther had announced her engagement, and wedding preparations were in full swing. Theodore insisted on a lavish ceremony at the city's most expensive hotel, the very place where he had first met Priscilla. Virginia, though inwardly disapproving of the vulgarity, didn't protest. She saw it as another move in the elaborate game Priscilla was playing. Months passed, and Virginia maintained her composure while quietly gathering information. She observed how Priscilla began inserting herself into their social circles, attending charity events and gallery openings where she knew Theodore would be present. Priscilla played her role with finesse, always polite and respectful to Virginia, never crossing overt boundaries in public. Yet, the tension beneath the surface was palpable. One day, as Virginia sorted through old family photos, a painful thought struck her. It wasn't the crumbling marriage that hurt the most, it was seeing Theodore transform into a puppet, obedient to the whims of his young lover. His dependence on Priscilla's approval was glaring. Virginia often felt the urge to shake him, to wake him from his daze, but she knew that direct confrontation would only make matters worse. Priscilla was playing a game, and Virginia needed to understand its rules before making her move. For now, all she could do was watch, wait, and collect evidence. She meticulously logged every oddity in Priscilla's behavior, every inconsistency in her words. Virginia was certain the woman would slip up eventually, and when she did, Virginia would be ready. One evening, Virginia stopped at the entrance of Le Petit Jardin, the small French restaurant she and Theodore had discovered 15 years ago. It was a place that had once been special for their now rare dinners together. The maitre d' quickly approached her with a warm smile. "Good evening, Mrs. Bullock. The doctor is already waiting for you at your table. Miss Hawthorne is with him." Virginia nodded faintly. Recently, Priscilla had been showing up more and more often, sometimes with colleagues from the hospital, sometimes under the guise of coincidence. Today, however, the coincidence felt carefully orchestrated. "Darling, look who I ran into!" Theodore stood up to greet her. "Priscilla was just telling me about a new technique we're planning to implement in the ward." "Good evening, Mrs. Bullock," Priscilla said sweetly, smiling. "I was just about to leave. I don't want to interrupt your dinner." "Not at all, stay." Theodore gestured to the waiter. "Virginia won't mind, will you, dear?" Virginia adjusted herself in her chair, watching as Priscilla skillfully took the seat directly across from Theodore, her usual spot. "Of course, join us for the evening," Theodore insisted. Virginia observed as Priscilla systematically dismantled the family dinner atmosphere. Each time Virginia tried to talk about her daughter or general plans, Priscilla deftly steered the conversation back to work. Theodore, ever passionate about his profession, eagerly followed, completely forgetting the original purpose of the gathering. "And do you remember, Ted, that case with the surgical complication?" Priscilla placed her hand lightly on his wrist. "If it hadn't been for your intuition." Virginia noticed the familiar Ted. She had been the only one to call him that before. Yet Theodore seemed oblivious, unfazed by the growing awkwardness. A few days later, the same dynamic unfolded at the country club. Virginia and Theodore had kept their membership for many years, but on the tennis court, Priscilla was already waiting, dressed in an elegant shawl. "I've signed up for tennis lessons," she announced. "Theodore promised to give me some pointers." "He did?" Virginia asked, raising an eyebrow. "I must have forgotten to mention it," Theodore replied. "You don't mind if we play a game or two, do you?" Priscilla, unsurprisingly, turned out to be a surprisingly clumsy learner who needed constant help perfecting her serve. Theodore patiently guided her, standing behind her to demonstrate the correct movements. Virginia silently gathered her belongings and left. That night, their conversation was brief. "You didn't even say goodbye," Theodore remarked. "I didn't want to interrupt the training," Virginia replied coolly. "Priscilla is learning. It's common courtesy to help a colleague," Theodore explained. Virginia met his eyes. "Ted, do you really not see anything strange about her behavior? She's just being nice. You're reading too much into it," Theodore replied dismissively. The following week, Virginia encountered Priscilla yet again, this time at her nail salon, where she'd been a loyal customer for over 20 years. Later, she found her at her favorite bookstore. The final straw came when Priscilla joined the Bullocks' Sunday brunch with their closest friends. "What a coincidence!" Priscilla exclaimed, sitting at their table. Mary Anderson, a longtime friend of Virginia's, raised a puzzled eyebrow. "How odd! I thought this was a private members-only club. Oh, Dr. Bullock kindly gave me a recommendation, Priscilla replied casually. Later, Mary pulled Virginia aside. Sweetheart, what's going on? That girl shows up everywhere you go. Theodore doesn't see it, Virginia replied flatly. He thinks she's just being friendly. Friendly? Mary scoffed. She's marking her territory like a predator. And forgive me for being blunt, but your husband is acting like a complete fool. Virginia remained silent, thinking about how Priscilla had methodically infiltrated every corner of their lives, and how Theodore, seemingly hypnotized, couldn't see what was painfully obvious. It was time to put an end to this prolonged charade. That evening, she calmly asked her husband, Ted, did you really recommend that Priscilla join the club? What's the problem? He replied, brushing her off. She's a good person, and it's beneficial for her to expand her social circle. Our club, where we've spent time with friends for 15 years, could be perfect for her. Jesus, Virginia, stop with these insinuations. You're being unreasonable. Virginia stared at her husband for a long moment. Very well, she said, her voice steady. Let's talk about what's truly reasonable. But Theodore was already looking at his phone, typing another message. Virginia knew exactly who it was for, Priscilla. Without a word, she stood up and left the room. In her study, she opened a folder containing the information she had gathered about Miss Hawthorne's past. It was time to use it. Sunday night. Virginia chose this moment carefully. Their daughter Esther was out visiting her fiancé, and the house was quiet. Theodore was seated in the study, flipping through some papers, reports from Priscilla about the new equipment, Virginia guessed. We need to talk, she said, sitting across from him. Theodore barely looked up. Is this about Priscilla Hawthorne again? Actually, it's Patricia Higgins, Virginia said, her voice sharp. That's her real name. Theodore's head shot up, concern flashing in his eyes before it quickly turned to irritation. Have you been following her? I've been checking into the background of someone who's suddenly gained far too much influence over our lives, Virginia said, pulling out the folder. And I found some interesting details. Before she could continue, Theodore raised his hand to stop her. There's no need. Priscilla already told me about her past. She changed her name to escape an abusive husband. That's private. An abusive husband? Virginia's laugh was bitter. Did she tell you about Dr. Reynolds? About how she drove him to suicide? That's slander! Theodore shouted, standing abruptly. I won't listen to vile gossip from a private investigator. Priscilla is a talented professional being poisoned by envious people. A talented professional, Virginia shot back. Hounded by financial scandals at every clinic she's touched. Look at these documents, Ted. These are facts, not gossip. Theodore glanced at the papers briefly before throwing them back. All I see are attempts to discredit an honest person. Jesus, Virginia, I didn't think you were capable of such petty jealousy. Jealousy? Virginia leaned forward, her voice rising. Ted, wake up. In the past month, you've signed 3 questionable contracts based on her advice. You've transferred large sums of money to a phantom company's account. Have you even read those documents? Don't you dare meddle in my professional affairs! Theodore's face turned purple with rage. Priscilla knows more about medical equipment than any manager. She's saving the department from bureaucrats like you. Saving it? Like she saved the Denver Clinic or the Alent Medical Group in Chicago, both of which went bankrupt after she got involved. She's younger than you, more professional. Theodore spat. She understands modern trends while you're stuck in the past with your accounting reports. Ted, listen to me. Virginia tried to steady her voice. This isn't about jealousy or your connection to her. It's about the fact that she's using you, your name, your reputation, your money. Shut up! Theodore yelled, spinning toward her. Don't you dare speak about her like that. Priscilla is the only person who believes in me, who supports my ideas. And you? You've always been too busy with your clinics. Virginia's voice trembled with anger as she fired back. I've built a business that has given us a flawless life, Ted. I made sure Esther got an education, bought this house. Yes, sure, Theodore interrupted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. A great businesswoman. And I am just a doctor who should be grateful for your generosity. Virginia rubbed her temples in exhaustion. This isn't about money. I'm trying to warn you, this woman is a professional scammer. I have proof. She threw the folder onto the table. I'm not willing to listen to these lies. Priscilla warned me that you would try to separate us. She said all the right things, that you wouldn't stop at anything to maintain control. She warned me. Virginia smiled bitterly. And what else did she say about me? To make me realize that our marriage has long since run its course. He walked toward the door. I'm leaving now. Don't try to smear a decent man again. Ted called her back. When was the last time you reviewed the branch accounts? That's none of your business. Check them. He placed another folder on the desk. And think about why your impeccable assistant is so interested in my clinic's tax records. He slammed the door without waiting for an answer. Virginia was left alone in the office. She knew Ted would now go to Priscilla, tell her about the conversation, and she would find a way to twist all the facts into evidence against her. Well, she had done what she could. Now she had to wait. Either her husband would come to his senses and review the documents, or she would have to act more decisively. For that, she already had a plan. The story of the engagement ring had been the first red flag. Esther had chosen an elegant vintage piece from a small jewelry store, a platinum ring with a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, perfectly matching her delicate fingers. Sweetheart, don't you think it's a bit old-fashioned? Ted suddenly intervened in their daughter's choice. Priscilla says modern brides prefer minimalism, he said, showing a catalog of stunning Cartier rings. Esther looked at her mother confused. Virginia calmly responded, Sweetheart, it's your ring. Only you can decide how it should be. But that was only the beginning. During a meeting with the florist, Ted suddenly declared that classic roses were a sign of bad taste. Priscilla recommends exotic orchids. They'll look better in the photos. But Michael and I have already chosen the arrangements. Esther frowned. And the budget has been agreed upon. Money isn't an issue. Ted dismissed her concerns. I've asked Priscilla to prepare a new budget. Virginia silently watched as her daughter clenched her fists under the table. That night, Esther entered her mother's office. Mom, what's wrong with Dad? Why is the nurse interfering in our wedding? Sweetheart, let's focus on the preparations. I'll handle this. But the situation only got worse. Priscilla started showing up at meetings with the wedding planner, supposedly by coincidence, whether at a restaurant or cafe. Her suggestions became increasingly insistent. Ted, sweetheart, I've found a fantastic place for the ceremony, the Lakeview Country Club. Much more presentable than that old chapel. But Michael and I want to get married where his parents did. Esther objected. Sweetheart, nobody cares about those sentimental traditions these days, right, Ted? Ted nodded. Priscilla's right. We need to think modern. Virginia noticed how pale her daughter had become after the meeting. She stopped her husband. Ted, this is Esther's wedding, not your mistress's. Keep her away from our daughter. Don't you dare say that. Priscilla just wants to help. She has excellent taste. Enhanced, engaging version. I'm just a doctor who should be grateful for your generosity, Virginia said, rubbing her temples in frustration. This isn't about money, she continued, her tone sharp. I'm trying to warn you, this woman is a professional con artist. I have proof. She slammed a folder onto the table. Ted's expression hardened. I'm not listening to these lies. Priscilla warned me you'd try to tear us apart. She told me you'd do anything to keep control, and now I see she was right. Virginia smirked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Oh, really? And what else did she say about me? That our marriage was over a long time ago. He shot back, heading for the door. I'm leaving now. Don't try to tarnish a decent man's reputation again. Ted paused at the doorway. When was the last time you reviewed the branch accounts? That's none of your business, she replied, her voice steady. Take a look. He dropped another folder onto the desk. And think about why your flawless assistant is so interested in my clinic's financial records. Without another word, he stormed out. Left alone, Virginia stared at the door, her mind racing. She knew Ted would run straight to Priscilla. The woman would twist the facts, spinning her lies into a web of deceit. But Virginia had done her part. Now she had to wait. Either Ted would uncover the truth himself, or she'd have to take more drastic measures. And for that she had a plan. Her suspicions had started with the engagement ring. Esther had chosen a stunning vintage design, a platinum band with a sapphire surrounded by delicate diamonds, perfectly complementing her graceful hands. Sweetheart, isn't it a bit old-fashioned? Ted had interjected unexpectedly. Priscilla says modern brides prefer minimalism, he added, waving a Cartier catalog. Esther glanced at her mother, confused. Virginia met her gaze calmly. It's your ring, darling. Only you can decide. But that was just the beginning. At a florist meeting, Ted dismissed Esther's choice of classic roses as tacky. Priscilla suggests exotic orchids. They'll look much better in photos. But Michael and I already picked the arrangements, Esther protested. The budget is set. Money's not an issue, Ted countered. I asked Priscilla to draft a new budget. Virginia sat silently, watching her daughter's clenched fists tremble beneath the table. Later that evening, Esther burst into her mother's office. Mom, what's going on with Dad? Why is a nurse meddling in my wedding? Focus on the preparations, sweetheart. Leave the rest to me. But things only escalated. Priscilla began conveniently, running into them at wedding planning sessions, her suggestions growing bolder. Ted, darling, I found a gorgeous venue, the Lakeview Country Club. It's so much classier than that old chapel. But Michael and I want to marry where his parents did, Esther objected. Sweetheart, nobody cares about those sentimental traditions anymore, right, Ted? Priscilla's right, Ted agreed. We need to think modern. Virginia couldn't ignore how pale her daughter looked after the meeting. She confronted Ted later. Ted, this is Esther's wedding, not your mistress's. Keep her away from our daughter. Don't you dare, Ted snapped. Priscilla's just trying to help. Her taste is impeccable. And contacts at the best wedding agencies are manipulating you, and you're letting them ruin Esther's big day. Esther didn't reply, glaring defiantly at her phone. A couple of days later, Priscilla sent over a list of vendors, all significantly more expensive than the ones already chosen. Along with it came a catalog of wedding dresses by an obscure designer. She's a friend of Priscilla, Theodore explained. She'll make an exclusive dress at a discount. Dad, I already ordered my dress, Esther said quietly. Mom and I picked it out a month ago. But you haven't even looked at other options, Priscilla says. Enough! Esther shot up from the table. I don't need that woman's advice. This is my wedding, my life, and I'm not going to let her ruin it. She stormed out of the room. Virginia found her daughter in the garden, sitting on the old swing Theodore had made for her as a child. I'm sorry, Mom. I shouldn't have blown up like that. It's okay, sweetheart. It's okay. Esther lifted her tear-streaked face. What's wrong with Dad? Why is he letting that woman meddle in everything? She even offered to be my maid of honor. Can you imagine? Virginia knelt beside her daughter. When did this happen? Yesterday. She called me directly and said Dad approved the idea. Virginia felt a cold fury rising within her. It was one thing for Priscilla to destroy her marriage, but hurting Esther was another matter entirely. Don't worry, she said, hugging her daughter tightly. Your wedding will be exactly as you want it. I promise. That afternoon, she walked into her husband's study. Did you seriously ask Priscilla to be the maid of honor? What's the problem? She could help with the planning. Ted, have you lost your mind? This is your daughter's wedding, not some fashion show for your mistress. Stop calling her that, he barked, slamming his fist on the desk. You're just jealous of her youth and energy. Virginia stared at him long and hard. "You know," she said quietly, "I endured your affair for a long time. I turned a blind eye to the humiliation. But I won't let you ruin Esther's wedding. Is that a threat?" "No, darling. It's a warning. Keep your Priscilla away from our daughter, or you'll regret it." She left the study, carefully closing the door behind her. A sealed envelope from the detective was already waiting on her desk. Inside was new material. It was time to take decisive action. Virginia sat in her office, methodically stacking the documents, photographs, bank statements, private investigator reports. All of it pointed to a carefully orchestrated scam. But now, she looked at the evidence with a different perspective. The maid of honor incident had been a turning point. It wasn't Priscilla's audacity. After all, what else could one expect from a predator like her? What shocked Virginia was Theodore's behavior. A man she had known for 26 years. Her daughter's father. A respected doctor. Not only had he allowed his mistress to interfere with Esther's wedding, but he had encouraged it. Virginia poured herself a glass of wine, a rare indulgence. She needed to relax and think. She was used to solving problems rationally, without emotion. It was this very quality that had once attracted Theodore to her, her ability to analyze a situation with a cool head. What had changed? At first glance, it was a simple story, an older man infatuated with a younger woman. A cliché. But Virginia knew her husband too well. This wasn't about age or even sexual attraction. Priscilla offered Theodore something far more intoxicating, the illusion of his own importance. She recalled their last argument. "You're just jealous of her youth and energy," he had said. "No, dear. I envy your delusion. It must be nice to believe that a young, beautiful woman admires you, thinks you're a genius, and supports every idea you have, even when those ideas lead to financial ruin." Her computer chimed softly, a new email from the detective. More documents about Priscilla's schemes. Virginia skimmed through them absent-mindedly. What was the point of gathering evidence against a mistress when the real problem was her husband? She pulled out an old photo album. There was Theodore, 20 years ago, a young, ambitious doctor willing to work around the clock to achieve his dreams. When had he changed? When had success and admiration become more important than the family he once cherished? And money replaced illusion, the professional dream, when the approval of others became more important than one's own principles. "Mom, can I see you?" Esther peeked into the office, wanting to discuss the seating arrangements for the wedding. They were discussing the details of the ceremony when the door slammed shut. Down the stairs, Theodore had returned. His voice sounded unusually loud in the hallway. "Of course, darling, I'll take care of everything." "Yes, right away." Esther wrinkled her nose in pain. "Again, her?" Virginia nodded silently. Her daughter left, and she stayed seated in her chair, staring at the sunset sky outside the window. The decision came suddenly, as if someone had flipped a switch. No more fighting with Priscilla. No more collecting evidence of her scheming. Let this story end in a different way. Let everyone see what the esteemed Dr. Bullock has become, and let his daughter be the first to witness it before it's too late. Virginia sighed and shuffled through the detective's files. "What are you talking about?" asked Daniels, frowning. "What is this paperwork?" The plan took form instantly, well thought out, ruthless, full of scandals and accusations, only the facts presented at the right moment. Let Priscilla corner herself with her self-confidence, and let Theodore see the truth of his praised reputation. Virginia methodically organized the documents into folders, double-checking dates and details. Her daughter's wedding would be the final act in this drama, and the ending would not at all be what the happy couple expected. "You chose this path yourself, dear," Virginia murmured, locking the folders in the safe. "You and your loyal knight." Now, it was just a matter of waiting and preparing for the big day in her daughter's life. A day that would be remembered by everyone present, but not in the way Priscilla Hathorne had planned. The final week before the wedding was surprisingly calm. Virginia was fully absorbed in the organizational details, hardly reacting to Priscilla's suggestions when she proposed replacing the classic menu with a trendy fusion. Virginia simply shrugged. Dear, I'm afraid it's too late to change anything. All the orders are paid for. Theodore watched these changes with suspicion. A couple of times he tried to provoke his wife into conflict, but she responded with mild fatigue. Let's not ruin our daughter's wedding. He was clearly confused by her change in attitude. On Thursday, Virginia stopped by the clinic to check the latest reports before diving into the final preparations for the wedding. The young receptionist nervously fiddled with some papers. Mrs. Bullock, Miss Hathorne is here. She's interested in the financial records. She said Dr. Bullock asked for them. All right, sweetheart. Give her copies of whatever she asked for. Just mark it in the log. Later that afternoon, she overheard some phone conversation about papers, the voice sounding excited. Of course, no, she didn't suspect anything. Esther was trying on her wedding dress in front of the mirror. Mom, you've been acting a bit strange lately. Is everything okay? Of course, dear. Just have a lot on my mind. Priscilla called on Saturday morning, apparently to confirm details for the ceremony the next day. Her voice was syrupy sweet. Virginia, would you mind if I helped with organizing the buffet? I have some great ideas. Thanks, dear, but it's all set. Rest up, gather your strength for tomorrow. Theodore stared at his wife, surprised. You really don't mind if I'm at the wedding? Why would I mind? She replied brusquely. He hesitated, unsure how to respond to such bluntness. Virginia was already immersed in reviewing the guest list, taking notes in her notebook. Priscilla was at the very end of the list, +1 at table 12, at the farthest corner of the room. She had spent the whole day handling calls, solving small problems, and calming her nervous daughter. The hostess checked the table arrangements again. The florist had sent photos of the finished centerpieces. Everything was going according to plan. That night, the detective called. Mrs. Bullock, I have the file. I've double-checked all the documents. Everything is flawless. What time should I be there tomorrow? 4 o'clock. Don't draw attention. She reviewed the safe, checking the folder of documents gathered over the past few months. Material on Priscilla's past, financial fraud, separate witness statements, Theodore's latest bank statements, his odd decisions, signed contracts, everything was ready. Theodore stayed late at the hospital, returning excited with bright eyes, saying something about new equipment and revolutionary techniques. Virginia nodded without listening. She noticed him sneaking messages, likely to Priscilla, informing her of another victory. That night she couldn't sleep, staring at the ceiling, thinking about tomorrow and how it would change the lives of everyone involved in this story. Theodore had chosen his path, and Priscilla had chosen hers. The morning came early. They had to meet with the makeup team, check that the banquet hall was ready, and go over the final guest list. Esther was worried, and Theodore was busy with the gifts, glancing at his phone from time to time. Everything was set. Tomorrow was her special day, Esther's wedding day, the day they would finally unmask themselves. It seemed fitting that Priscilla, digging through Virginia's clinic records, would find some inconsistencies, perhaps intentionally planted. And she decided to use them for blackmailing. She might have misinterpreted legitimate financial transactions or deliberately twisted the facts. In other words, she's trying to blame Virginia for something she herself is guilty of, a classic manipulation tactic. The wedding was flawless. Esther was glowing with happiness, Michael couldn't take his eyes off her, and the guests were enchanted by the young couple's heartfelt vows. Even Theodore seemed to have momentarily forgotten about his phone, truly happy for his daughter. The banquet hall at the Mayfair Hotel had exactly the look Esther had dreamed of: floral arrangements, dim lighting, soft music. Virginia personally attended to every detail. She noticed Priscilla's disapproving glance at the decoration but chose to remain silent for now. The first chimes rang during the welcome toasts. Priscilla, dressed in an inappropriately revealing dress, was whispering to Theodore. He kept nodding, frowning, while consulting papers on his phone. After the third toast, Priscilla asked to speak. She started from afar, talking about the importance of honesty in a family, how lies were often hidden behind a beautiful facade. Virginia noticed Detective McCormick sitting in a discreet corner of the room, tense. But still, many of the people present had no idea they were being watched in clinics built on deception. Priscilla's voice rang out, full of rightful anger. As a medical professional, I cannot stay silent. Virginia Bullock paused dramatically, casting a victorious glance over the silent room. Theodore looked at his mistress with admiration. She had rehearsed this speech in front of him. You're a thief and a fraud, Priscilla accused, pointing a manicured finger at Virginia. I have proof of financial fraud in your clinics. All those charity programs and social projects are just a front for money laundering. An indignant murmur spread through the room. Esther turned pale, and Michael grabbed her hand tighter, while Virginia remained calm, nodding to her bodyguard. A tall man in a strict suit placed a heavy folder on the desk in front of Priscilla. What's this? She opened the first page carelessly, hesitating. Her face quickly lost color. This, my dear, is a real financial fraud. Virginia's voice was low, but the entire room heard. The story of your fascinating career, Phoenix, Denver, Chicago. The same modus operandi everywhere. Affairs with the medical chief, access to documents, mysterious bankruptcies, and then a new name, a new city, and a new victim. She pulled out photographs from the folder. Do you recognize this man, Miss Higgins? Or should I call you Patricia? Dr. Reynolds wasn't as fortunate as the others who admired you. His widow sends her regards. Priscilla shook herself, heading toward the exit, but the bodyguard subtly blocked her path. Virginia continued, You know what's curious? The documents you were going to use against me are just routine charitable transactions. Everything legal, everything transparent. But you're scheming to buy hospital equipment. Has Theodore ever checked where that money goes? Theodore sat with his head in his hands, bank statements in front of him, the story of his own downfall organized by date and amount. You didn't plan to cause a scene at my daughter's wedding, Virginia shook her head. But you chose the time and place. She gestured to the detective. Detective McCormick, deliver the paperwork to Lieutenant Harris. It seems the IRS is quite interested in Miss Higgins's activities across several states. Priscilla erupted into Theodore's arms. You won't let them do this. We'll explain everything. But he stepped back, looking at her with different eyes. Maybe for the first time, he saw her for what she truly was, a calculating fraudster, not a woman in love. Esther stood up from the table. I think it's time for the guests to go to the garden. There's a buffet there. I believe we should let the authorities do their job here. She stood with notable dignity. Truly, she was her mother's daughter. Michael ushered the guests out, leaving the main characters of the drama alone in the room. Virginia, Theodore tried to speak, but she stopped him with a gesture. Not now, Ted. Your lawyer will have the divorce papers tomorrow. Right now, it's our daughter's wedding. Try not to ruin it completely. She stepped out into the garden, where the guests were quietly talking, discussing what had just happened. It was going to be a long night. She had to save her daughter's party. She'd handle the rest later. The garden buffet looked like an absurd theater. Guests gathered in small groups, glancing occasionally at the main building of the hotel where the police were talking to Priscilla. Waiters moved silently between tables, pouring champagne, but most glasses remained untouched. Virginia methodically made her way through the guests, apologizing for the unpleasant incident. Theodore's colleagues from the hospital discussed the situation in hushed voices. Apparently, many had suspected something was wrong with the equipment purchases for some time, but had kept silent out of respect for the chief surgeon. Dr. Harris, an old family friend, swirled his glass thoughtfully. I tried to hint to Ted that this woman was interested in the financial records for some reason, but it was like he was deaf. Mary Anderson, sitting beside him, sighed. Blind? Well, he's probably lost what was left of his mind. I'm sorry, Virginia, but your husband acted like an idiot, she said, nodding toward the corner of the garden. Esther cried quietly on Michael's shoulder. From time to time, guests approached with condolences, but the young husband firmly, though politely, shut down any attempt to discuss what had happened. An hour later, Theodore appeared in the garden, haggard, his eyes red. He made a beeline for his daughter, but Michael stepped in front of him. "Sir, I don't think now's a good time," he said. "I must explain." Theodore tried. "Explain what?" Esther's tear-streaked face lifted. "You were sleeping with an adulterer, or you let her ruin my wedding. You seriously thought she loved me? She seemed so sincere. And Mom, did you even think about Mom when you brought your mistress into our family spaces? When you let her interfere in the preparations for my wedding?" Theodore looked around helplessly, searching for support, but only found disapproving stares. His colleagues turned away defiantly. Family friends shook their heads. "I'll fix it," he muttered. "I'll talk to the police. I'll explain everything about the team." "Explain what?" Esther shot back. "Dr. Harris couldn't take it anymore? How you signed fake contracts? How you let that scam artist get her hands on the hospital's budget? Ted, you're facing not just a divorce but a serious investigation." Esther stood up, her voice rising. "Dad, I always defended you, even when Mom hinted you were cheating. I told myself everyone makes mistakes. But you let that woman come here, make a scene, accuse Mom. I don't want to see you again." She turned toward her mother. "Mom, Michael and I are probably going on vacation anyway. It's all ruined." "No, sweetheart." Virginia shook her head. "It's your day. We're not going to let it be ruined." She nodded to the hostess, and soon music began playing in the garden. The waiters started serving hot appetizers. Life was slowly returning to normal. Theodore continued trying to explain himself to one group of guests after another, but no one listened. The colleagues discussed who would take over the department after the soon-to-be dismissal of the chief neurosurgeon. Family friends remembered how Theodore had changed in recent months. "You know," Mary said wistfully, watching Theodore's slumped figure, "Virginia was right not to cause a scene before everyone saw his true face." By nightfall, it was known that Priscilla had been arrested. Her past cases in other states had come to light. Theodore left without saying goodbye, and Esther, now calmer, shared her first dance with her husband. The festivities continued, although not exactly as planned. Virginia watched her daughter dance and thought that sometimes, the most painful lessons were the most important. Esther had grown that day. She had seen life for what it was, without filters. As for Theodore, well, he had chosen his own path. When the guests parted ways, they carefully avoided the scandal topic, but everyone understood that the Bullock family would never be the same. And perhaps, that was for the best. Theodore sat in his hospital office, mechanically reviewing papers. In 2 hours, the internal investigation would begin, but he already knew the outcome. Too many documents signed by his hand, too many questionable decisions made under Priscilla's pressure. The hospital halls were unusually silent. Staff members steered clear of the neurosurgery department. The nurses who had smiled at the chief doctor the day before now looked away when he passed. In the residence room, they whispered about the wedding scandal. Theodore opened the safe and pulled out a folder with documents for the new team. Everything had seemed so right before. Priscilla had convincingly explained the urgent need for purchases, the advantages of certain suppliers. But now, reviewing the contracts with fresh eyes, he saw blatant inconsistencies, exorbitant prices, odd delivery conditions, unknown middleman companies. There was a knock at the door. His assistant, Dr. Warren, brought the preliminary results of the audit. "Ted, this is serious," Warren said quietly, avoiding eye contact. "Almost 2 million have passed through ghost companies. The board is demanding your resignation." Theodore nodded. He had expected this. But worse than that was something else. His reputation, his career, his years of hard work were all on the line. Everything had crumbled like a house of cards because of a beautiful scam artist with an angelic face. He remembered the first time Priscilla had appeared in the operating room. Impeccable work, an intuitive understanding of his demands, sincere admiration for his technique. Now, he realized it had all been calculated. She had learned his habits, his weaknesses, his ambitions. She had played on his vanity, leading him step by step to make the right decisions. The phone on his desk rang incessantly, journalists, lawyers, colleagues from other hospitals, but he didn't answer. What could he say? That he had let a young lover ruin his life? That he had betrayed his family's trust, his friends' trust, his patience? Virginia had tried to warn him. She had brought him some documents, spoken of Priscilla's past. He had called his wife a jealous hysteric, protecting her lover, letting her interfere in family matters, ruining his daughter's wedding. Thinking of his daughter made him physically ache. Her wedding day, the day that should have been the happiest of her life, had turned into a nightmare, and it was his fault. The father she had trusted. Quick footsteps echoed in the hallway as the hospital's head of security entered the office, followed by 2 police officers. "Dr. Bullock, we need to inspect your office. Please hand over all documents related to equipment purchases." He nodded silently. The officers methodically searched the cabinets, photographing papers. He looked out the window where the hospital park was soaked in golden autumn light, and he thought about how quickly his carefully constructed life could crumble. The lawyer who arrived an hour later mentioned something about parole, about a deal with the investigation, and advised him to testify against Priscilla to emphasize his role as a victim of fraud. Theodore listened without enthusiasm. What did it matter now? He arrived home in the afternoon, and the great mansion greeted him with an oppressive silence. Virginia had picked up her things in the morning, leaving the divorce papers on the table. He went up to the study and poured himself a whiskey. On the wall hung his diplomas, certificates, and photos from medical congresses, the life he had built over 30 years. In a drawer, there was a photo of him and Priscilla at a charity event just 15 days ago. She smiled at the camera, her hand on his shoulder, and he gazed at her with adoration, not noticing the condescending smile at the corner of her lips. How could he have been so blind? Why hadn't he seen the obvious manipulation? He had allowed them to destroy his family, his career, his reputation. And for what? The illusion that a young, beautiful woman genuinely admired him. The phone rang again, and Essayer's name appeared on the screen. He picked up the receiver but froze. What could he say to his daughter? What words could explain his betrayal? The call went silent. Theodore sat in the dark, staring at the blinking city lights outside the window. The epiphany had come too late, the cost too high, and there was nothing he could do about it. The lawyer placed the documents on the table in neat piles. Virginia read each page carefully, without hurry. Property division, financial agreements, business obligations, everything required meticulous scrutiny. "Mrs. Bullock, given the circumstances, we can demand more favorable terms," said the lawyer, tapping the papers with his pen. "His minor offenses, the public scandal, no need to mention them." Virginia shook her head. "We'll split the property equally, as we agreed. I won't seek revenge or humiliate him any further." A week passed. After the wedding, Esther and Michael went on their honeymoon. Virginia insisted they stick to their plans. The story with Priscilla started to fade. The press found new sensations, and financial frauds rarely captured the public's attention. For a long time, Virginia immersed herself in her work. Her clinics needed attention, several important projects were near completion. She held meetings, met with partners, reviewed reports, a familiar rhythm that helped her maintain balance. Mary Anderson tried to take her out to dinner to socialize, meet new people, but Virginia declined, not out of depression or resentment, she simply didn't see the point of social entertainment. She had other plans. The next morning, she met with a real estate agent. A spacious apartment in the city center was perfect for the next chapter of her life. The mansion, where Theodore and she had lived for 20 years, should go to him. Too many memories, too much of the past. "Are you sure?" Essayer asked during the video call. "This house means so much to you, darling." "A house is just walls," Virginia replied. "What matters is what we carry inside." She wasn't joking. The decision to divorce didn't come during the scandal, the wedding, or even when she first learned of it. It had been growing gradually with every display of Theodore's weakness, every session of his manipulation by his lover. It wasn't about betrayal. She could understand the weakness of a man, his infatuation with a young woman. It wasn't about financial machinations. Money had never been fundamental to their relationship. It was about how easily he abandoned his own principles, how he allowed a stranger to invade their family, how he had betrayed not only her, but also his own daughter. Theodore tried to contact her several times, sending messages and leaving voicemails, but she didn't respond, not out of pride or resentment. She simply didn't see the point in explaining herself. It was all said and done. The new apartment slowly started to feel like home. Minimalist furniture, plenty of light, a study with a view of the city, no family photos, just abstract paintings and her favorite books. A new space for a new life. In the afternoons, she often sat by the panoramic window, watching the city lights flicker on. She thought about the past, not with bitterness, but with understanding. 26 years of marriage had taught her a lot. The most important lesson was to respect herself and never let others overstep her boundaries. The divorce had to be done discreetly, with as little publicity as possible. Theodore accepted all the conditions. It seemed he realized she could have demanded much more. A serious investigation awaited him. His career was ruined, his reputation lost, but those were the consequences of his own choices. Esther was gradually adapting to the new reality. She still loved her father but no longer idealized him. Perhaps that, too, was part of the maturation process, seeing her parents as real people, with all their flaws and mistakes. Virginia didn't take pleasure in her ex-husband's downfall, nor did she feel satisfaction in the discovery of Priscilla. Revenge had never been her goal. She was simply protecting what she considered important: her family's dignity, her daughter's future, and her own self-esteem. Life went on. She had plans to grow her business, new projects, ideas to expand her clinic network. She wasn't going to stop or look back. Theodore and Priscilla's story was now in the past. Lesson, experience, reminder that sometimes you have to let go of people who no longer align with your values. After all, dignity isn't about fashionable words and nice gestures. It's about the ability to stay true to yourself, maintain your principles, and keep moving forward, no matter what. And that, Virginia had always been strong at.